Thank you, Deputy President. When we hear leaders in Australia and around the Western world talk about the rules-based international order, what they're referring to is international law and its institutions. Things such as the law of the sea, the international human rights laws, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, treaties, conventions and trade agreements, along with the institutions that legislate, enforce and uphold international law: the United Nations, the World Trade Organisation, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. They are the rules and they are the tribunals that interpret and enforce, that provide the order. It's a good thing that we have rules that protect the relationship between nations, but more importantly, that sometimes protect people from their own nations. However, I'm concerned that this concept is being undermined and eroded by the very nations who shout about it the loudest. The United States and their allies are always ready to raise international law when it comes to the so-called freedom of navigation missions into the South China Sea, or in relation to the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we see these same nations undermining international law of the ICC and the ICJ when it suits them. Let's look at some examples. The attempt to extradite Julian Assange to the US is the first one. The US has spent over a decade trying to prosecute an Australian journalist under draconian US laws for exposing American war crimes, despite his actions having taken place outside of the United States. In response to the publishing of war crimes, former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said Assange should, quote, answer for what he's done, while Chuck Schumer, who's now the US Senate Majority Leader, tweeted that he hoped Assange would, quote, soon be held to account for his meddling in our elections. Assange has spent more than a decade incarcerated, while the United States has been attempting to extend their territorial jurisdiction beyond their own borders and hold journalists potentially anywhere in the world subject to their national security laws. This is a circumstance where one of our so-called friends, the US, despite the calls by our Prime Minister for this to end, despite calls to the US President Joe Biden for this to end, have continued to persecute one of our citizens. Contrast this with criticism of China. Australian journalist Cheng Lai was released after 3 years of incarceration by China. We're still waiting to get Julian Assange back from our so-called friends, the UK and the US, after more than a decade. Second example sees states including the US and Israel undermining the important work of the ICC when it comes to prosecution of individuals in Israel for genocide. In response to the recent actions of the ICC in seeking warrants against Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, for their role in potential crimes against humanity, US President Biden immediately sought to undermine and threaten the ICC's integrity. Biden, in a statement, said the ICC's prosecutor's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is outrageous. The US Secretary of State Blinken went even further, stating the United States has been clear since well before the current conflict that the ICC has no jurisdiction over this matter. In an extraordinary step, Blinken, in the following days, signalled that he would be willing to work with conservative American lawmakers to place sanctions on ICC officials and court staff. It's incredible that the nation that paints itself as the great upholder of the rules-based international order is willing to threaten the officials that uphold that very order that is alluded to, simply for doing their job by attempting to hold those who enable war crimes to account. The US and its allies are the first to support the ICJ and ICC when it rightly prosecutes individuals for breaches of international law in Africa or for the illegal actions of Russia against Ukraine, but they'll immediately seek to distance themselves, undermine or even threaten these same institutions when they uphold the same duties against the United States allies. It calls into serious question the commitment of the West to international law and the legitimacy of the US's espoused international order. It's difficult to treat statements that the international rules-based order is paramount seriously when those states who call for it the loudest fail to universally support them. The best way to preserve and promote this order is to abide by it.
Thank you.